So I actually started out the morning class by saying, first of all, this is lovely. I will say I haven't taught an evening class in a very long time. And so I would say by popular demand, I was asked, like, would you teach an evening course? And it's like, sure, why not? And I suspect that it's one of the lovely perks of Zoom, because it's been hard to get people to come and gather in the evening in person. But because of Zoom, everybody can just do this obviously from the comfort of wherever they are. So it's wonderful to see all of you. Some of you I was with this morning in the morning class. And so nice to see you again. And some of you we haven't studied together in a class like this. So welcome. I'm thrilled that we're all together. I actually started out by saying this morning that there's a tradition in Judaism that when you study together, that when you learn together, that you that very often you dedicate your learning, and you can dedicate it in honor of someone, you can dedicate it in memory of someone. So I feel the appropriate thing to do this evening is to dedicate the learning that we're going to do together to the people of Ukraine. Um, and it's terrifying. I'm sure, like me, we're all watching this on the news. I check multiple times a day, and it's pretty horrifying. Though I also said this morning, but I'll repeat myself, I have this letter that I wrote in my head to my great grandparents that goes something to the effect of, "Dear great grandparents, Russia has attacked the Ukraine, parentheses, the Soviet Union fell. The president of Ukraine is Jewish, and the prime minister of Israel has offered to mediate a peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine. Would love to get your thoughts." Because this would just, I mean, in the course of Jewish history, and I don't mean to be glib about this, I mean, what's happening there is horror, but as a Jew, and thinking about the course of Jewish history, there are a lot of scenarios that I said my great grandparents, but I think even my grandparents would not even be able to imagine. The players it's Jewish history is always interesting. So I want to say a little bit about the Shalom Hartman Institute. The curriculum that we will be using together for the next 4 weeks comes from Shalom Hartman. It's a pilot program. We were fortunate to be one of the congregations that was chosen. So for us, the curriculum was all free, which is always lovely. And all I need to do is use it and then let them know, how I think that it went. So the Shalom Hartman Institute is an institute in Israel that's dedicated to, really, I would say, teaching Jewish texts, but doing it in a way that's different than probably any other organization. I participated in their Rabbinic Leadership Institute, which was a 4-year fellowship paid for by our federation. And it was a program where they brought rabbis together, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, to study together, which does not happen in many places in the world. We couldn't pray together. There was no way that we could have a minyan together, but we could learn together. And there was something very powerful about that, in spite of our differences, that we would have the opportunity to learn together. They do sessions for Hillel directors, for Jewish educators, for Christian leaders, for educators in Israel, they do something for the Army. They have a yeshiva for high school students. And their most recent project, which they launched a few years ago, is MLI, Muslim Leadership Institute, where they bring American Muslim leaders to study at Hartman and to study Jewish texts and to learn about our narrative, our Zionist narrative. So lots and lots of interesting things, and it's all built around the study of Jewish texts. And so this was their first foray into adult Jewish education for the American public to be taught in the United States. By the way, they're opening an office in Chicago, a brand new office in Chicago, which is opening, I'm not sure when, soon. So we'll see if there are more educational opportunities that they will be bringing to Chicago, which is wonderful. They don't have offices all over the country, so this is a big deal for Chicago, and hopefully there'll be more opportunities to learn. So this curriculum is, this is about 40 units. There's ethics, peoplehood, faith, and practice. So we're going to look at the first 4 units together over the next 4 weeks of the ethics curriculum. And if it's something that people enjoy and want to continue learning, then I'm happy to continue, but I thought, I've done many adult education classes that are open-ended, and you just come and they never end. I had a group studying Torah on Tuesdays for, I don't know, 5 years, 8 years, a long time. So I decided that nobody has to make a multi-year commitment, that we'll do it in units and we'll see how it goes. Every unit, all of these Zooms are being recorded. So if you should miss a class, have no fear. And in a couple of days after the class is over, it will be posted on the website, and you can feel free to watch it whenever it's convenient for you. So tonight we're going to begin our conversation about Jewish ethics. And David Hartman, Alav HaShalom, Professor Rabbi David Hartman, who was the founder of the Institute. He is a rabbi, originally was a rabbi in Montreal, and then made Aliyah, and eventually founded this institute. So he talks, and this is true about Jewish ethics, but it's not only. Other cultures and religions would probably frame ethics in the same way, which is he categorizes it in 2 ways: creation ethics and covenantal ethics. So what we're going to look at tonight is what he refers to as creation ethics, and next week we will look at covenantal ethics. And what is the difference? Creation ethics are, what do we owe all human beings, no matter what their religion is, what their background is? What do we owe to a person just because they're a human being? And this really is only going to scratch the surface of that. There's a lot more that could be said than what we're not going to cover everything. But what do we owe a human being, any human being? And next week will be, and what do you owe somebody who's part of the covenant? What do you owe somebody that's Jewish? And obviously there's overlap. They're Jewish, so they get to be treated like a human being. But there are certain things that you owe your community. And I'll give you just an example, that I think that we've all been dealing with just with these last few days with Ukraine, which is, where do we want to donate our money? Do you want to donate your money to an organization that's helping all refugees? Do you want to donate your money to an aid organization? Do you want to donate a subset of your money to a Jewish organization that's helping Jews? And obviously, I think that we all feel compelled that we would want to help as many people as we could help. But at the same time, I will speak for myself. I also feel a certain obligation to wanting to help the Jewish community in the Ukraine. And I'm going to even slice that and dice that and make that even smaller, which is, as I sent to the congregation, I decided to make my donation through the Masorti Olami organization, which is supporting the conservative movement in Ukraine. Because a lot of the money that's going to come through Jewish organizations to Ukraine, to Jewish organizations in Ukraine, a subset of that is going to go to Chabad, because they also have institutions. They also, the biggest JCC is run by a Chabad rabbi. And so my feeling was, I personally want to support a community that's not only Jewish, but is egalitarian, where women can fully participate and count in the minyan. And so that's, so we make, all of us, right? All of us make these types of choices. And it has not just with your tzedakah money, but with resources in general. what was the commercial with priceless, right? Like what price do you put on saving a human life? If you had unlimited resources and you could save everybody, you would save everybody. But what happens when you don't have unlimited resources? How do you make certain decisions? So I had sent you the text, so hopefully you have them. You can print them up or you can open them up on another screen. I have this weird glitch on my computer through this Am Yisrael account that neither Brian nor Nancy can figure out. It's a great mystery, which is when I share my screen, I can't see you. I can only see the text. Now, what's weird about this is on Shabbat, when that is not true. When I share my text on Shabbat, I can minimize them. So we can't figure out why this won't work. We just don't know, which means that I'm not going to just leave the text up the whole time. So I will share the text and then I will take it off and then I will put it back up, which is why one of the reasons that I sent you text, so that if you needed to see it, you would be able to do that, because sometimes it's hard to discuss something that that you can't see in front of you. So we will begin at the beginning. When we look at creation ethics, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we go to the creation story in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, at the very, very beginning, when God is creating the world. Of course, we know that God begins the creation of the world, and the very last day of creation, God creates human beings. And it says in one of the most hopefully famous verses in the Torah, and God created the human being in God's own image. In the image of God did God create it. Male and female, God created them. So I always say, thank God this verse is in the Torah, because you could have easily not taken for granted that women were created in the image of God. If the Torah hadn't said that, probably the assumption would be that men were the prototype, right? That men were created in the image of God and, women not. So yay, it's there. This didn't ensure, that Judaism was egalitarian from its inception, but it gave us something to build on. So all human beings are created in God's image. So I'm going to stop here and ask you, what do you think that means? Anybody? All right, I'll cue you. So okay. Who does this include? Deanna?
I think when it says, when we're all created in God's image, I don't know that it means physically in God's image. I think it means more spiritually, emotionally, like the goodness of God. Although honestly, in the last year, I do question some of that, but so I don't think it's a physical image.
Well, isn't it like there's like the 13 attributes of God, and then we're like supposed to see ourselves in those attributes laid out?
So right, so our tradition believes that God doesn't actually look like anything, right? So when we say we're created in the image of God, it doesn't mean God has a nose and God has ears and God, though there are metaphors where we maybe talk about on the high holidays, there's a prayer that every living human being is resting in God's hand, but we don't really mean that, right? It's a metaphor. So it's not physical. So it's something else, right? That we have attributes that God has. Sharon, you have your electronic hand up.
So I was thinking metaphorically as well. I was thinking in God's image as we have the ability to think and feel and act. And in the next passage, it says that we are above all the other plants and animals. And to me, that's God's image, because we have the abilities, sort of not necessarily to control nature, but we're able to create things. We are able, fire and ingenuity and invention and civilization. To me, we almost have a form of creation in man.
And human beings create. right?
Right.
Human beings create, whether it's building things or art or creating other human beings. There's a prayer in Judaism, Baruch She'amar v'haya olam, God spoke and the world came into creation. And the only other, as far as we know, the only other living being that can create through speech are human beings, right? So we, and the rabbis talk about following it, as God is merciful, you be merciful, that we're supposed to understand that God has certain attributes and that we're supposed to imitate those attributes. But the other thing when we say that human beings are created in the image of God, which is so obvious, but should still be stated, is everybody, no matter what you look like, no matter what the color of your skin is, no matter what you believe, no matter who you voted for, everybody is created in God's image. And therefore, everybody needs to be treated a certain way. Which of course is, I would say it's still aspirational. We're still trying to get there as a society. I just saw something on the news. I'm going to assume it's true. It's particularly sad. But there are Black Africans living in the Ukraine who are now refugees and coming to the border and are not being treated the way the white Ukrainian refugees are being treated. So, this is we have a lot, obviously, of work to do. But the idea that everybody, that when you look at another human being, and this is not easy, right? When you look at another human being, ideally, if you were accessing that level of spirituality, if you were looking at another human being, you wouldn't just be, I don't like the term so much child of God because it doesn't sound so Jewish, but that's what you'd be looking at, right? You would recognize that this person is also like you, created in the image of God. And so, of course, from that, then there are certain things that flow. So let's go on with a few more sources. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and reign over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heavens and over every beast crawling upon the earth. So you're also like God in that you are the top of the food chain, right? Human beings are in charge of the world. Now, it's interesting. You may not know this, but there are two different tellings of creation, of the creation story in the Torah. Genesis in the first chapter, Genesis in the second chapter. Because you might say to me, well, men and women are created in God's image. Hey, Rabbi, where's that story about Eve and the rib? That's chapter 2. So there's the one telling that both are created in the image of God, and then there's the other telling of that Adam went to sleep and God took out his rib and built him a partner. In Genesis 1, it says we are supposed to rule over the world and keep shuha. We are supposed to conquer the world and rule over it, which probably sounded a lot less scary thousands of years ago. Because how much damage could you really do, right? A couple thousand years ago, like you could, if you were lucky, you could beat back the wilderness and make a little place for yourself and farm a little land and have a few animals. And, how much damage could you really do? Today, to hear that human beings are supposed to rule over the world and conquer it is a little bit more frightening because of the unbelievable damage we had. There's a whole section on environmental ethics in this curriculum. But in the second Genesis story, the one with the rib story, it says we're supposed to shomer, we're supposed to be guardians of the earth. So you have this, So you have this like double balance between ruling over but guarding. So somehow we're supposed to strike this balance, but that's supposed to be our, we're in charge, right? I guess like God is in charge in the heavens, where human beings are in charge on the earth. And in the hierarchy, human beings are higher than animals, which actually comes into play also when you talk about ethics. I tell this story all the time when I want to give this illustration. When I was in rabbinical school, there's nothing more humbling than teaching teenagers. Every time I even say we're the only people on, in the universe, as far as we know, in the universe that can create with words, I hear a teenager saying, "How do you know?" And maybe just not be discovered yet. So if you remember long, I don't know, 40 years ago, there was the case of the baboon heart, right? They were going to transplant a bamboo heart into a human being. And there were animal rights activists that were protesting this. And so I was teaching a group of high school students, and in a Jewish high school curriculum, human life is at a higher priority than animal life. So in the curriculum, the example that they gave was your dog is swimming out to sea and it's starting to get swept away by the current, and you start to, swim out to save your dog. And then all of a sudden, a stranger starts yelling, help, help. Who do you save? Well, every teenager said their dog, which is supposed to be the wrong answer, right? Like that, but I love my dog and that person is a stress. So it didn't work, right? It didn't work, it was a bad example, because the answer in Judaism is a human life takes precedent over an animal life. If you are making that, if you are having to make that ethical choice. So hopefully you don't have to ever do that, but human beings are considered a higher form of life in the Jewish hierarchy. Okay. So what do we owe people, right? What do we owe people then, that flowing out of this idea that all human beings, and there's a way that Judaism sort of frames this, and we're going to look at the sources that frame this in two different ways, is there a minimum, is there a maximum? Is there a minimum that first do no harm, or do we need to be proactive in helping human beings? And surely your blood of your lives will I require, from every beast will I require it, and from the human being, even from every person's fellow, will I require the life of the human being. One who sheds a person's blood, by human being shall their blood be shed, for in the divine image did God make the human being. So I just wanted you to look at this and think about what is this text here to teach us? So what is this text here to teach us? What aren't you allowed to do?
Well, the second part is it seems a lot like the eye for the eye. You're not allowed to, kill another or harm another.
Right. So you cannot kill a human being. And if you kill a human being, you're liable for the death penalty. By the way, the Torah does say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And the rabbis interpret that as monetary compensation. So there are times, and we're going to see this later on in another text, there are crimes that one could commit that you could pay a monetary compensation. So you poke somebody's eye out. You're not actually liable in Jewish tradition to have your eye poked out, but there is a formula. What's the cost? What's the eye worth? How would you determine what an eye is worth? Well,
how many pieces of silver is that?
How many pieces? It depends on probably the time you're living in, right? But I don't know what the answer is, because you have to figure out, and what would an eye be worth? Meaning how much, if you can't work anymore, if you can't get around anymore, the pain, if there are medical bills, which of course in ancient times, I'm not sure what a medical bill would have looked like, putting a patch on, I don't know.
There really is that in workers' comp.
Exactly. Thank you. Right. In workers, it's right. I mean, some of this is, ancient law is right. You lost wages. And what if lost wages are forever? Or what if it's for a finite time? Or what if you had a job where you had to, you couldn't do anymore because you only had one eye and therefore you lost income. So all of those things, but not murder, right? Not murder. If you murder somebody, you are liable for the death penalty. Interesting, what the other text, this text is also saying is if your animal kills somebody, that animal has to be killed. So, which may be okay, because maybe you don't want that kind of animal, out and about in the world. But in any case, so the interesting thing about this text is that you can't, well, we all know from the 10 Commandments that you're not allowed to murder. It is interesting to note that as we say that, human life has infinite value and that we are created in the image of God, that capital punishment was an accepted form. I mean, it was, there was Judaism had capital punishment. Really up until rabbinic times. So certainly in biblical times. And Israel has only used capital punishment once with whom? Eichmann, right? Adolf Eichmann was the only time that that Israel had somebody they had capital punishment. All right, so all life is created in the image of God, but if you shed the blood of another person, you are liable for the death penalty. Now here Hartman brings a very interesting text, which is, so we would say minimally, you can't hurt somebody, right? I'm going to stop for a second here. Minimally, if everyone's created in the image of God, you can't hurt them. You can't harm them. And if you harm them in some way, you're liable. But are there times when you need to be proactive, not just to not harm people, but to save somebody or to protect somebody? And so this is a really interesting example, because in the Bible, and also to the beginning of rabbinic times, Jews were allowed to have slaves. Now that may come as a surprise to some people, because it's like, wait a minute, what about the story of the Exodus from Egypt? And, we were freed from slavery. What do you mean we were allowed to have slaves? So I hate to shock everybody, but Israelites were allowed to have non-Israelite slaves. They were not allowed to have Israelite slaves, though they could have Israelite indentured servants that were freed after 7 years. The rabbis of the Talmudic period basically legislated both capital punishment and slavery out of existence. The rabbis wouldn't say that you couldn't have slaves because it was clearly permitted, but what they basically started doing was saying there's a certain wage that you have to pay them, there's certain housing you need to provide them, there's certain meals that you need to provide them. And what ended up happening is that it was economically no longer advantageous. You couldn't take advantage of your slave, and so it was like hiring somebody to work, and so basically was legislated out of existence. But so this is still, a biblical verse. You shall not deliver to one's enslaver a slave who is saved from their enslaver with you. They shall dwell among you in the place in which they shall choose within one of your dwelling places where it is good for them. You shall not wrong them. So what is this teaching us? Why would okay, I'll just stop. What is this teaching us? You're allowed to have slaves, but what happens when a slave runs away from its owner and
So
makes
a runaway slave can't be you can't return a runaway slave
can't
to
return a
their
runaway slave.
to their owner.
What? I turned it on, but it's not on.
Right. You can't return a runaway slave to its owner, right? You have to, Kaplans, I'm going to ask you to mute if you don't mind. You can't return. The assumption is, of course, that if a slave runs away, he was or she was being mistreated, and you can't return somebody to a situation where they will be mistreated, and they are then basically, if they get away, they're free. Even if you yourself are a slave owner, right? Like yes, Deanna.
Okay, this so completely okay, let me start by saying I don't think slavery is the thing.
Right.
However, how does that even make sense then? Because then every slave would have every reason to run away because that's all you have to do to get on. So,
Yep.
I mean,
But they have to run away and not be caught and
run away and not
get
be
to
caught.
somebody who will protect them. But how did that play out in the South in the United States? So Jews were slave owners in the South. Were Jews abolitionists generally in the North? Did they? I don't know,
We're
did they use
complicated
principles come
people,
into play?
Sharon.
What?
We're very complicated people. If you want to read another work by Dara Horn, not just focus on People Love Dead Jews,
Yes.
she spoke about, she's an amazing novelist, and she wrote a book called, I believe it's called A Different Night.
All
The
Other
Remedy
Nights.
of the Haggadah.
I think it was All Other Nights.
All Other Nights. Okay, yeah, I think A Different Night is the Haggadah. All Other Nights. She actually spoke, JUF brought her in one year, and she was our JUF speaker, and she spoke on that book. She's wonderful of a writer she is. She's an amazing speaker too. Anyways, in that book, there is a scene in the South of a Jewish family hosting a Seder, and their slaves are serving the meal. And it is, we'd like to think, that that Jews were not slave owners in the South, but they were.
Oh, totally.
There were certainly Jews that were abolitionists. There were rabbis in the abolitionists. There was a rabbi in Maryland, a Reform rabbi, who had to escape in the middle of the night and come north because he was an outspoken abolitionist and he put his life at risk. So, we find Jews on every, I said, we're a complicated people. We find us on the divide, But the interesting question is if you set up a society where you allow slavery, but you have a system where if a slave runs away, you have to protect them. It actually could have incentivized the slave owner to make a situation, a much more pleasant situation for the people that are slaves, so that they don't want to run away. Now, the thing that I think that we also have to remember in ancient times is sometimes people sold themselves into slavery. Slaves were not necessarily always people that were captured and brought over against their will. That people sometimes sold themselves into slavery because otherwise they would starve to death. So if you were in a situation where somebody sold themselves into slavery and then you spent money and then they ran away, too bad for you. So you might want to be in a situation where you create a living environment for this person that would make them not want to run away. So this is, the thing about Judaism that's also, I think, different, and this is different in American law. I always think about the end of the very final episode of Seinfeld, right, where they're arrested for being bystanders. But in the United States, you actually, I don't believe you can be arrested for being a bystander. We hear every once in a while about these horrible cases where somebody's yelling, help, help, and nobody calls the police, and those people that didn't do anything didn't do anything. That's not true in Jewish law. In Jewish law, you are not allowed to be a bystander. So if you hear somebody yell, help, help, you have to do something. Ideally, if you can stop the situation without, risking your own life, you're supposed to stop the situation, or you call the police, or you get help. But if you do nothing, and you are liable in Jewish law, you're not allowed to be, it's against Jewish law to be a bystander. I don't hear this so much well, actually, never mind. I don't hear this much anymore. I hear this all the time now. As long as I'm not hurting anybody else, I can do what I want with my body. Judaism doesn't believe that either, right? In theory, Jews should not be anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers, but again, because we're a complicated people, you're still going to find people on every divide. But in Judaism, you really can't say I can't do whatever I want with my body, and I can't do whatever I want in society. It's a very, we have a much more communal way of looking at what we owe other people in society. And you can't just turn away. You can't just, there are Torah texts that they didn't bring that talks about you can't stand idly by. It says it very specifically in the Torah. This is the interesting thing about you teaching curriculum that I didn't create, is the question of, which I don't know the answer to, why did you choose these verses and not those verses? Because there are plenty of other verses like don't stand idly by, or am I my brother's keeper, right? In the story of Cain and Abel, people tend to use that quote totally out of context. Am I my brother's keeper? I.e., I'm not, so why are you asking me this? But in the Torah, when Cain kills Abel and God says to him, I hear Abel, where's Abel? I hear his, blood is crying out from the ground. And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? The answer to that is, well, yes, you are. Yes, you are. Like, that's the answer to the question. You are. And so this idea that it's not just first do no harm, it's that we owe people things in society. So
You kind of see that in Israel to a certain extent, that, if somebody, an Israeli will cut you off to save 5 seconds, but if somebody has a heart attack and is laying on the ground, there'll be a crowd of 20 people, not there to watch, but there to help.
Right. There was one story in the Israeli paper a couple years ago that there was a hit and run and like nobody stopped. And the whole society was like outraged. Like, what has happened to us that nobody, like the gut, like it's a, it's a much tighter. My mother-in-law used to love to tell this story that they tried making Aliyah. They came back, but they were there. I don't know. I think it was 1968. They were there. She was there with 5 little kids. So she left them outside the grocery store and while she was shopping, and a woman came in the grocery store and said, whose kids are running around out there? There are 5 kids running around out there. And she's like, oh, well, those are mine. She's like, well, they shouldn't be doing that. I'm going to watch them until you finish shopping. And she loved that story, right? Like that, Israelis can be very harsh in the way they may speak to you. May not be the way some of our Midwest sensibilities like that we're used to hearing. But the idea that a stranger would say, I'm going to watch your kids while you're shopping,
Walking in now.
here we'd be like, don't get near them. How do, we like run out screaming, like we're strangers not watching our kids. But in Israel, there's kind of the sense that nobody's really a stranger. There, if you, somehow somebody who knows somebody. So yes, it's obviously it's a much smaller society. Listen, American small towns used to be like that too.
Yeah, I know. I listened.
American small towns used to be much more that people were watching over their neighbors and watching over the neighborhood kids who were playing outside. Okay, Melissa, watch the State of the Union. We're TiVoing. We're not that far behind you. So, unfortunately, we've kind of lost that.
There's the 24
To a
people.
certain extent, I feel like it's what we try very hard. It's not always
It's this number.
but what we try very hard to do at the
Oh, that's
synagogue,
23.
right? Like, how do you
That's
take a
up.
big,
Yeah, 20.
anonymous society and make it small and create community and have people have a place to be? All right, we're going to look at one more text before everybody starts to drop off for the State of the Union. There are parts of this text that may be familiar to you, but surprisingly, you may not know that it comes in a bigger discussion about the death penalty. So okay, you have the death penalty. And remember, I told you the rabbis kind of legislated out of existence. So this is how they begin to legislate it out of existence. So you have a witness, right? First of all, if there's a capital case, you have to have witnesses, more than one. They brought them in and admonished them, saying, perhaps you will say something that is only a supposition or hearsay or secondhand, or even from a trustworthy person. Or perhaps you don't know, we shall check with your examination and inquiry. So are you sure? Are you sure you saw what you really saw? Are you sure it wasn't just hearsay, or somebody, even a trustworthy person might have said something, but you didn't actually see this yourself? Are you sure? So and did you even know you were going to be cross-examined? So you make it really hard on the witnesses to make sure that the evidence is real evidence, and not just hearsay or something they heard secondhand. Or maybe you didn't know maybe you came forward and you didn't know you were going to be cross-examined. And if you say, yeah, well, I didn't know, then okay, you're dismissed. No more ever, the capital cases are not like monetary cases. In monetary cases, a person may pay money and so make atonement, but in capital cases, the witness is answerable for the blood of who is wrongfully condemned and the blood of their would-be descendants to the end of the world. So if you help convict somebody who's innocent, and they are subject to the death penalty, you yourself are now a murderer. And you've not only murdered this person, but you've murdered their offspring for all time to come. And this is from the Cain and Abel story. So we have found with Cain that murdered his brother, for it says, the bloods of your brother cry out. So it doesn't say the blood of your brother cries out. So the rabbis are like, why is blood plural? And they answer it by saying, because you don't just kill one person, you kill all of their offspring forever. Another saying is the bloods of your brother, that the blood was cast over trees and stones. Okay, so that's capital cases. So you can have capital punishment, but you better be really, really, really careful in who your witnesses are and whether your witnesses are trustworthy witnesses. Okay. Therefore, humanity was created in the world first as an individual to teach that if any person has caused a single life to perish, they are deemed by scripture as if they had caused a whole world to perish. And everyone who saves a single soul, they are deemed by scripture as if they have saved the whole world. So you may know this from the end of Schindler's List. If you don't know it from anywhere else, you might not have known it was from the Gemara, from the Talmud, from a Mishnah, that it was in the context of capital punishment. But the question is, when we talk about the creation story, why does our story start with Adam and Eve? This seems a very inefficient way to populate the whole world. If this is the goal for human beings to be fruitful and multiply, it seems like pretty slow going to create a man and a woman, and all of humanity flows from them. And so we're going to see why that is important. And it plays out with the idea of who we all are. We're all the descendants, regardless race, creed, color, where you live, where you came from. We're all the children of the same parents. And the murder of one person is as if you're murdering all of the world, and the saving of one person as if you are saving the whole world. So that's, and you may not know that flow came out of a discussion about capital punishment. So why was a single person created? For the sake of peace among humankind, that one should not say to another, my father was greater than your father, right? If Adam and Eve are the parents of everybody, then in theory, this should make us more peaceful, more kind to one another, because that means we're all relatives, right? We're all related to one another. We're all cousins. And Judaism, this story tries to flatten the hierarchy, right? I'm not better than you because I'm richer or because I have a higher status in society. I'm not any better than you because we're all from the same family. Another reason humanity was created as an individual is to challenge the heretics so that they should not say there are many ruling powers in heaven. So this has to do about monotheism, right? That unlike the pagans that believe that there are many gods, and some gods created the heaven and the sea and and the trees and the gods of the stars and the gods of that. Our story tells us that there's one God that creates everything. So the first reason is nobody can say that my father is better than your father because we all have the same father. 2, our creation story comes to tell us that we have one God that created everything, not many gods that created many things. And then this starts to talk about what it means to be created. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Another reason why humanity was created as an individual is to proclaim the greatness of the Holy One, For humans stamp many coins with one seal, and they're all like another. In other words, when the emperor made a coin in his image, every single coin looks the same, right? If you look at a dollar bill, the picture is the same on every dollar bill, right? That's what it means when a human being creates an image of themselves. Every image, if you're good, it looks the same. But when God stamps human beings with the image, in the image of God, so God stamps. The sovereign of sovereign has stamped every human being with the seal of the first human being yet not one of them resemble the other exactly. So it's actually one of those kind of mind-boggling
I don't
things
think I'm
you thought
recording.
about late at night when you were in college and maybe on certain substances, about what does it mean to say that every human being is created in the image of God, and no human being that has ever existed, except for maybe if you were a twin, looks like anybody else. That every human being that was ever created is uniquely only them. It's it's sort of when you take it for granted, but if you really think about it, if you really believe in God, or even if you don't believe in God and you just believe in science, like how the heck did that happen? That of all of the billions of human beings that ever lived, each one is an individual. So the unbelievable thing is a human being wants to make their likeness. It will always look, every stamp will look the same. When God puts his likeness on us, part of that is that every human being is unique. So to be in God's image is to be unique. And hence, if you then do something to that unique person to harm them or to kill them, you have actually taken something away from God. Not only have you killed this human being, but you've taken a piece of God's image away. So you've diminished not only the human being, not only everybody that will ever live after that person, but you have actually, as if you have actually done damage to God and to God's image in the world. Deanna, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, when our first child was born, there was a moment in the delivery room, and I kind of thought exactly what you're saying, which is it's kind of amazing. And if anybody ever needed proof of a God, the fact that most of the time, the two cells turn into the same thing, but unique and different. I mean, and even identical twins have their own unique fingerprints.
Right, they have their own personalities. They may their faces may look the same, but they're individuals with their own soul and thoughts and whatever. So when we talk about creation ethics, right, the idea of when we talk about creation, so this is a very universal way of looking at ethics, right? That every human being that's ever existed, to recognize the uniqueness and the special nature of every single human being is to enhance God's image in the world. And anything that you do to detract from that detracts from God's image in the world. And frankly, when you think about when people question whether there's a God, they may question whether there's a God if something terrible happens in their own life. But what tends to make people question God is human beings' inhumanity to other human beings. How could there be a Holocaust? How could there be, we're looking at it right now. We turn on, it's to watch what's happening in Ukraine in real time, to see an evil person who has the power to perpetrate this type of evil, and to watch it on the news at night. And these are the things that shake people's faith. Interestingly, I'm going to suggest, I don't know if this is true, that earthquakes don't tend to do that. Tidal wave, like there are other terrible things that happen in the world, but it's human evil that really confounds us, I think, the most. And that's exactly what this text is saying, that human evil diminishes humanity and it diminishes God's presence in the world. I just want to see if there's anything left in that text that we should.
So there is so much to unpack in this text. Like you could do a whole class, I think, on this text.
Sure.
Could you read it in sort of the flip that because we all descend from the same two and we are all related, is there an argument in there that's we have to disperse justice equally? Like, do they use this for sort of like the courts and the legal, that justice is dispersed equivalently?
Well, listen, there are plenty of texts in Judaism about justice, right? About setting up courts and honest weights and measures and not favoring the rich and not favoring the poor. There are tons of sources on, the famous verse from the Torah, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, right? Justice, justice shall you pursue. When we did the Torah project and you could sponsor a verse, all the lawyers wanted to sponsor that verse, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, right? Like so justice is a very important part of our tradition, and I would say of our ethics. But then the question, and this is where we'll turn our attention next week, is, well, okay, but what about your own community? What about your own people? What about other Jews? Do you owe them something different than you owe the rest of humanity? And how do you balance the universal and the particular? And, in a way, I'm not sure that our ancestors in the shtetl asked those questions, because it was so clear, right? That like the worlds were so separate, that you thought about it maybe philosophically, but you didn't think about it that it had real practical import in your life. You lived in your insular Jewish community, and it was hard enough to take care of that community. We as Jews in a modern society have the privilege of being able to ask the question of how we balance universal and particularistic, everybody and our own community. And, we actually get to take these values and really put them to the test, because we all have a foot in both worlds. None of us live in an insular Jewish community, and you all belong to a synagogue. So none of you are separate from the Jewish community either. So how you then balance these two things becomes a real ethical issues that we, have to figure out. Yes.
So could you describe, and this is away from Judaism necessarily, but why a fair amount of hardened criminals go to prison, they come out and they become very religious, God-believing people that maybe they went in there, they weren't, they may had some kind of difficult crimes that they were in prison for, they end up studying, the Bible and come out and they become very religious. That can be related? Can you relate that to
No,
this?
it's interesting because it's the exact opposite, but I think it has something to do with Christianity, which takes it, and the people that are in those prisons. I mean, there are rabbis that work in prisons, but when a couple of years ago, I was working on a strategic plan for the Rabbinical Assembly. And as part of we did these like learning journeys where we would go visit places that we think might be interesting, that would have something that we could learn. So I went with Rabbi Annie Tucker, and we went to visit Willow Creek Church out in one of the western suburbs, because we wanted to learn about how they greeted people, how they welcomed people. I think they have 20,000 members on Sunday morning. If their auditorium is filled, there's 20,000 people there. How did they take something big and make it into something small? So that was interesting in and of itself. But we were there in December, and they were working on a project through their church where they were sending a package to every single prisoner in Illinois. And in that package, there was a little, treat. And I don't know what else was in there, but there was a New Testament, and there was a brochure about how you could connect with this church even while you were in prison. So you have people that are working with this community, and it's a vulnerable community, and they're offering salvation and a second chance and a personal relationship. And so for some people, that's really appealing, especially when they get out of prison. And we know that there's a problem with recidivism. So for many people, it's a path out. I don't know, like I wonder if, in Israel, if there must be rabbis that work in the prisons, but I wonder if they have, it's a bit of a different message. So I don't know, if it would work in the same way. I go visit and be like, well, first let me talk to you about the text, and then we can, so it's not quite as, it's a different approach. Anybody else? Okay, well, I know, thank you for staying on, even though we've got the State of the Union coming up. Hopefully you TiVoted and we can, jettison ourselves back into the real world where these ethical issues are unfortunately very real and very frightening. So that's why it's good to be together. All right, see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye.